The autumn rain drummed softly against the tall windows of Windsor Castle as the royal household continued its somber routine. 3 months had passed since the Queen's peaceful departure, yet the palace still felt heavy with grief. Servants moved quietly through the corridors, their footsteps muffled on thick carpets that had witnessed decades of history. In the private wing where the late Queen's personal belongings remained untouched, security was tighter than ever. The head of the Royal Guard, a distinguished man in his 50s with silver hair and kind but alert eyes, made his regular rounds each morning. He had served the crown for over 20 years, and his loyalty to the late Queen's memory ran deeper than duty alone. The Queen's rooms had been sealed according to strict royal protocol. Every piece of jewelry, every book, every photograph held not just monetary value, but immense sentimental importance. The late Queen had been very specific in her final wishes about how these treasures should be distributed. Some items were destined for museums, others for specific family members, and many were to remain as part of the Crown's permanent collection. On this particular Tuesday morning, the Royal Guard was reviewing security reports when his assistant knocked gently on his office door. A meeting had been requested by the Queen Consort. Nothing unusual about that, he thought. The royal family often needed to discuss security arrangements or access to various parts of the estate. Camilla arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, dressed elegantly in a navy blue coat. She wasn't alone. 2 of her adult children accompanied her, along with what appeared to be a family friend or advisor. The Royal Guard welcomed them politely into his office, offering tea as was customary. But this wasn't a routine security meeting. As Camilla settled into her chair, her tone became businesslike and determined. She explained that, as the new Queen Consort, she felt it was time to address the distribution of certain personal items that had belonged to her predecessor. She had compiled a list, she said, reaching into her handbag to produce several typewritten pages. The Royal Guard accepted the documents, his expression remaining professionally neutral as he scanned the contents. His heart sank as he read. The list included some of the most precious items from the late Queen's personal collection. There were pieces of jewelry that had been in the royal family for generations, rare first-edition books from the Queen's private library, and several paintings that held deep personal significance. Most concerning of all, many of these items had already been specifically allocated in the Queen's will to other recipients or designated for permanent preservation. The late Queen had spent considerable time in her final years ensuring that her beloved possessions would find appropriate homes after her passing. Camilla continued speaking, her voice growing more confident as she outlined her reasoning. As Queen Consort, she argued, certain privileges and entitlements naturally came with the position. She felt that some of these items would be more appropriately placed with her own family members, who would treasure them and ensure their proper care. Her children nodded in agreement, clearly having discussed this matter extensively beforehand. The Royal Guard found himself in an incredibly delicate position. On one hand, he understood the complexities of royal hierarchy and the sensitive nature of family dynamics during such a difficult time. On the other hand, his primary duty was crystal clear: to honor and protect the late Queen's explicit wishes as outlined in her legal documents. He chose his words carefully, explaining that while he deeply respected her position and understood her perspective, there were existing legal protocols that governed the distribution of the late Queen's estate. These weren't arbitrary rules, he emphasized, but carefully considered directives that the Queen herself had established after much thought and consultation with legal experts. Camilla's expression hardened slightly. She had expected some initial resistance, but she clearly believed that her request was reasonable and within her rights. She pressed further, suggesting that surely some flexibility could be shown, particularly for items that might not be explicitly mentioned in the official documents. The conversation stretched on for nearly an hour. The Royal Guard maintained his respectful but firm stance, while Camilla grew increasingly frustrated with what she perceived as unnecessary bureaucratic obstacles. Her family members remained mostly silent, though their presence clearly provided moral support for her position. As the meeting concluded, Camilla made it clear that this was just the beginning of the conversation, not the end. She would be seeking additional opinions and exploring other avenues to address what she saw as a reasonable request. The royal guard watched them leave, a growing sense of unease settling in his chest. That evening, as he walked through the Queen's former private quarters during his final security check of the day, the royal guard couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much larger storm. The rooms remained exactly as the Queen had left them, peaceful and dignified, filled with the gentle presence of a life well lived. He paused at the Queen's writing desk, where a silver-framed photograph showed her in younger days, surrounded by her beloved dogs in the palace gardens. The late Queen had been very clear about her wishes for a reason. She understood the complexities of family dynamics and the potential for conflict after her passing. Every decision had been made with careful consideration for fairness, tradition, and the long-term well-being of the monarchy itself. Word of the meeting began to spread quietly through the palace staff over the following days. The tight-knit community of servants, many of whom had worked at the palace for decades, found themselves in hushed conversations during their breaks. Some had witnessed the late Queen personally selecting items for specific recipients, knowing exactly who she wanted to inherit particular treasures and why. The palace cook, who had served the royal family for 30 years, remembered how the Queen would sometimes show visitors around her private collection, explaining the history and significance of various pieces. The head housekeeper recalled the Queen's final months, when she had spent considerable time reviewing her possessions and making detailed notes about their future. Meanwhile, Camilla began making subtle inquiries among other palace staff about access to certain rooms and storage areas. She asked casual questions about inventory procedures and seemed particularly interested in items that might not be prominently featured in official documentation. Her behavior suggested that she viewed this initial rejection as merely a temporary setback rather than a final answer. The royal guard increased security protocols around the Queen's personal effects, ensuring that detailed logs were kept of anyone who requested access to these areas. He also began consulting with the palace's legal team, wanting to ensure that he fully understood every aspect of the situation and the proper procedures for handling such requests. As the days passed, the tension began to build throughout the palace. Staff members found themselves caught between loyalty to the late Queen's memory and the complex realities of serving the current royal family. The situation was unprecedented in many ways, and everyone seemed to sense that much larger confrontations might be looming on the horizon. The royal guard continued his duties with unwavering professionalism, but privately he prepared himself for what might become one of the most challenging periods of his long career in royal service. The news traveled through the palace like ripples in a pond. Within 48 hours of that first meeting, nearly every member of the household staff had heard whispers about the Queen Consort's unusual request. The palace, despite its grandeur and size, was really like a small village where everyone knew everyone else's business. In the servants' dining hall, conversations grew quieter when supervisors walked by. The longtime butler, who had polished the late Queen's silver for over 30 years, shook his head sadly as he shared tea with the head gardener. They remembered how particular the Queen had been about her belongings, how she would personally show them which pieces held special memories and needed extra care. The palace seamstress, a gentle woman in her 60s, recalled the countless hours she had spent mending the Queen's favorite cardigans and adjusting her formal gowns. She knew that many of the items now being requested had deep personal stories attached to them. The Queen wasn't just a monarch to these people. She had been their employer, their constant presence, and in many ways part of their extended family. But not everyone felt the same way about the situation. Some of the newer staff members, particularly those who had joined the household in recent years, wondered if perhaps some compromise could be reached. After all, they reasoned, family dynamics were complicated, and grief affected people differently. Maybe the queen consort was simply trying to create her own connection to the late queen's memory. The royal guard noticed these divisions during his daily interactions with the staff. He had always prided himself on maintaining good relationships throughout the palace, but now he sensed an uncomfortable tension in the air. People seemed to choose their words more carefully around him, and he sometimes caught fragments of conversations that stopped abruptly when he entered a room. Meanwhile, Camilla had not given up on her mission. Instead of accepting the initial rejection, she began approaching the situation from different angles. She started making what appeared to be casual visits to various parts of the palace, often accompanied by one or more of her children. These weren't official tours or scheduled appointments. They seemed more like exploratory trips. The head housekeeper first noticed this pattern when she encountered Camilla examining the contents of a display cabinet in one of the queen's former sitting rooms. When questioned politely about her visit, Camilla explained that she was simply trying to better understand the layout of the palace and familiarize herself with the late queen's personal spaces. It seemed reasonable enough on the surface, but these visits became more frequent and more focused. Camilla would spend long minutes studying particular paintings, asking detailed questions about their history and provenance. She showed special interest in pieces that weren't prominently featured in official palace tours or documentation. Her children would take photographs, claiming they wanted to remember their grandmother-in-law's beautiful collection. The palace librarian became particularly concerned when Camilla spent an entire afternoon in the queen's private library, carefully examining rare first-edition books and making notes in a small leather notebook. When the librarian offered assistance, Camilla politely declined, saying she preferred to browse quietly and reflect on the queen's literary tastes. These behaviors began to make the staff increasingly uncomfortable. The queen's personal spaces had always been treated with special reverence, and this level of scrutiny felt inappropriate to many of the longtime employees. They found themselves in the difficult position of wanting to be respectful to the queen consort, while also feeling protective of their late employer's memory and possessions. The Royal Guard received several quiet reports about these visits from concerned staff members. They weren't making formal complaints, but they wanted him to be aware of what was happening. He began discreetly monitoring the situation, ensuring that security cameras captured these visits and that detailed logs were kept of which areas were accessed and when. During one of these unofficial tours, Camilla encountered the palace's senior lady-in-waiting in the queen's former dressing room. This woman had served the queen for over 20 years and knew every piece in the royal jewelry collection. She watched with growing alarm as Camilla opened various jewelry boxes and examined their contents with obvious appreciation. When Camilla commented that certain pieces would look lovely on her daughter, the lady-in-waiting felt compelled to mention that most of these items had specific designations in the queen's will. Some were meant for museums, others for particular family members, and several had deep historical significance that required special preservation protocols. Camilla's response was politely dismissive. She suggested that wills could sometimes be overly restrictive, and that family needs might change over time. After all, she reasoned, the queen couldn't have anticipated every situation that might arise after her passing. Surely some flexibility was both possible and appropriate, especially for items that would be cherished by loving family members. This conversation left the lady-in-waiting deeply troubled. She had witnessed the queen spending countless hours in her final months, carefully considering the fate of each precious item. These weren't casual decisions, but thoughtful choices based on relationships, historical significance, and the queen's deep understanding of what would best serve the monarchy's future. The tension reached a new level when Camilla began bringing what appeared to be appraisers or advisors to the palace. These individuals weren't introduced to the staff. and their presence created additional discomfort among the household. They would examine various items with professional scrutiny, sometimes using magnifying glasses or other tools to assess details that seemed to go beyond casual appreciation. The royal guard found himself in an increasingly difficult position. His job was to maintain security and follow protocols, but he also needed to be respectful of the queen consort's position within the royal family. He couldn't simply bar her from accessing parts of the palace, yet her behavior was clearly causing distress among the staff and potentially undermining the late queen's carefully planned legacy. He decided to schedule another meeting with Camilla, hoping to address the situation diplomatically. This time, he chose to meet in a more formal setting, his official office rather than a casual sitting room. He wanted to convey the seriousness of the concerns that had been raised while maintaining appropriate respect for her position. When Camilla arrived for this second meeting, she brought a larger entourage. Along with her children, she was accompanied by what appeared to be a legal advisor and a family friend who seemed well-versed in royal protocols. The message was clear. She was treating this as a serious negotiation rather than a simple request. The conversation quickly became more intense than their first meeting. Camilla presented what she called a revised proposal, suggesting that perhaps they could start with just a few smaller items as a gesture of goodwill. She argued that this would help establish precedent for future discussions about larger pieces. The royal guard maintained his position, but he could sense that the situation was escalating beyond his ability to handle diplomatically. Camilla's team began discussing legal precedents and questioning whether the late queen's will had been properly executed according to all relevant protocols. They suggested that some items might fall into gray areas where interpretation could be flexible. As the meeting concluded, both sides seemed to recognize that they were approaching a point of no return. Camilla made it clear that she would be exploring all available options to pursue what she saw as her legitimate rights. The royal guard understood that he would need to prepare for much more serious confrontations in the days ahead. That evening, he made several important phone calls to legal experts and senior palace officials, knowing that this situation was about to require intervention from much higher levels of authority. The morning started like any other Tuesday, with the palace staff going about their usual routines. The head gardener was tending to the late queen's favorite rose garden, while the kitchen staff prepared breakfast for the royal household. But by 11 o'clock, everything would change in a way that none of them could have imagined. The royal guard was reviewing security reports in his office when his radio crackled to life. One of his junior officers was calling from the queen's private wing, his voice carrying an unusual note of concern. The queen consort had arrived with a small group, and they were requesting access to the late queen's personal study. This wasn't unusual in itself, but something about the situation felt different. When the royal guard arrived at the scene, he immediately understood his officer's concern. Camilla stood outside the study's ornate wooden doors, but she wasn't alone. Her two adult children flanked her on either side, and they had brought along several large bags and what appeared to be protective wrapping materials, the kind of supplies you might use when carefully packing valuable items for transport. The queen's personal study had been her most private retreat. It was where she had written her Christmas speeches, reviewed state papers, and kept her most treasured personal belongings. The room contained not just official documents, but also deeply personal items, photographs of her late husband, letters from her children and grandchildren, and a collection of first-edition books that she had assembled over decades. Most significantly, this room housed a glass display case containing some of the queen's most precious jewelry. These weren't the crown jewels that belonged to the state, but personal pieces that held enormous sentimental value. Among them was a particular set of pearls that had been a wedding gift from her late husband, worn on countless special occasions throughout their long marriage. As the royal guard approached, Camilla turned to greet him with a confident smile. She explained that she had come to collect several items that she felt would be better preserved in her family's care. She gestured toward the study as if she already had permission to enter, and her children began moving toward the door with their packing materials. The royal guard felt his heart rate increase. This was the moment he had been dreading since their first conversation weeks earlier. He knew exactly which items Camilla was referring to, and he also knew that every single one of them had been specifically designated in the late Queen's will for other purposes. He stepped forward, positioning himself between Camilla's group and the study door. In his most diplomatic voice, he explained that he couldn't allow access to remove any items without proper authorization through the legal channels that governed the Queen's estate. His words were respectful but firm, and everyone present understood that this was not a casual suggestion. Camilla's expression shifted noticeably. The friendly confidence disappeared, replaced by a look of determination that bordered on defiance. She reminded him of her position as queen consort and suggested that surely some exceptions could be made for family members who simply wanted to preserve precious memories of their beloved queen. Her eldest child stepped forward to support their mother's position, arguing that these items would be treasured and protected within the family rather than sitting unused in storage. They pointed out that the late queen would have wanted her belongings to bring comfort to those who loved her, not gather dust in sealed rooms. The royal guard maintained his position, literally and figuratively. He explained that the late queen had spent considerable time making specific decisions about each item's future. These weren't arbitrary bureaucratic rules, but careful choices made by someone who understood exactly what she wanted for her legacy. Thus, conversation began to attract attention from other palace staff. A housekeeping supervisor had been walking down the corridor and stopped when she noticed the unusual gathering. Soon, a second security officer arrived, having been alerted by his colleague's radio call. Even some of the kitchen staff found reasons to pass through the area, sensing that something significant was happening. Camilla seemed to realize that they were drawing an audience, and her frustration became more apparent. She suggested that they move the conversation to a more private location, but the royal guard knew that leaving his post would send the wrong message. The study door represented more than just physical access. It symbolized the boundary between respect for the late queen's wishes and family pressure to override them. The standoff continued for nearly 20 minutes, with neither side willing to back down. Camilla's children grew increasingly uncomfortable as palace staff continued to gather nearby. They whispered among themselves, clearly not having expected this level of resistance to what they had assumed would be a straightforward family matter. The tension reached a peak when Camilla attempted a different approach. She suggested that perhaps they could simply enter the study to look around and pay their respects without actually removing anything. This would allow them to assess the situation and potentially identify items that might not be covered by the formal legal restrictions. The royal guard recognized this as a significant escalation. Allowing unsupervised access to the study would essentially give Camilla the opportunity to build a case for future claims on specific items. It would also set a dangerous precedent that could undermine the entire system of protocols that protected royal estates. He politely, but firmly, declined this request as well, explaining that the study remained sealed pending the complete resolution of all estate matters. This wasn't personal, he emphasized, but a standard procedure that applied to everyone equally, regardless of their position within the royal family. At this point, one of Camilla's children suggested that perhaps they should contact King Charles directly to resolve the situation. This threat hung in the air like a challenge, clearly intended to pressure the royal guard into reconsidering his position. Everyone present understood the implications. This could become a direct conflict between the king's wife and the palace security protocols. The royal guard felt the weight of his decades of service in that moment. He had sworn an oath to protect the crown and its traditions, but he also served at the pleasure of the current monarch. If King Charles sided with his wife, it could mean the end of his career and potentially set a precedent that would forever change how royal estates were handled. But he also thought about the late Queen's final months, when she had carefully reviewed her possessions and made thoughtful decisions about their futures. She had trusted him and others to honor her wishes, and that trust felt more important than any potential consequences to his personal situation. The standoff was interrupted by the arrival of the palace's senior legal advisor, who had been summoned by another staff member. This distinguished gentleman in his 70s had served the royal family for most of his career and commanded enormous respect throughout the palace. His presence immediately changed the dynamics of the situation. After quickly assessing what was happening, the legal advisor requested a private conversation with Camilla. They moved to a nearby sitting room, leaving the royal guard at his post and the children standing awkwardly in the corridor with their now obviously unnecessary packing materials. The conversation lasted nearly 45 minutes, during which time the gathered staff gradually dispersed back to their duties. But the tension remained thick in the air. Everyone seemed to sense that this confrontation was just the beginning of something much larger. When Camilla and the legal advisor emerged from their private discussion, her expression had changed again. She looked frustrated but also somewhat chastened, as if she had received information that complicated her previous assumptions about her rights and options. She approached the royal guard once more, but this time her tone was different. She announced that she would be postponing her visit to the study while certain legal matters were clarified. However, she made it clear that she still believed her requests were reasonable and that she would be pursuing other avenues to address what she saw as an unfair situation. As Camilla and her children gathered their unused packing materials and prepared to leave, the weight of the confrontation settled over everyone who had witnessed it. The royal guard remained at his post, but he knew that this was far from over. What happened next would be talked about in palace corridors for years to come. Instead of leaving after her conversation with the legal advisor, Camilla made a decision that surprised everyone present. She turned back toward the Queen's study and announced that she wasn't going anywhere until this matter was properly resolved. Her children exchanged worried glances. This wasn't part of any plan they had discussed. The packing materials they had brought lay forgotten on an ornate side table as the situation took on a life of its own. What had started as a family request was rapidly becoming something much more serious and public. The royal guard found himself in uncharted territory. In all his years of service, he had never faced anything quite like this. Royal family members simply didn't stage protests in palace corridors. There were proper channels, established protocols, and diplomatic ways of handling disputes. But here was the Queen Consort, refusing to leave until she got what she wanted. Camilla positioned herself in one of the antique chairs that lined the corridor, settling in as if she had all the time in the world. She announced that she would wait right there until King Charles could be contacted and brought in to resolve what she called this bureaucratic nonsense. Her tone suggested that she fully expected her husband to side with her once he understood the situation. The palace staff didn't know how to react. Some tried to continue with their normal duties, but it was impossible to ignore the unprecedented scene unfolding in one of the most formal areas of the castle. Others found excuses to walk through the corridor, stealing glances at the Queen. Consort sitting in what could only be described as a protest. The head housekeeper, a woman who had worked at the palace for over 30 years, watched from a respectful distance with growing alarm. She had seen royal family disagreements before, but they were always handled privately, behind closed doors. This public display felt dangerous to the monarchy's reputation and the carefully maintained dignity that the late Queen had worked so hard to preserve. Meanwhile, word of the standoff spread throughout the palace with remarkable speed. The kitchen, staff whispered about it while preparing lunch. The groundskeepers discussed it during their break. Even the palace guards stationed at the main entrances heard rumors about something unusual happening in the Queen's private wing. The royal guard remained at his post by the study door, but he could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him. Some of the junior security officers had arrived to provide support, though nobody was quite sure what kind of support might be needed. This wasn't a security threat in any traditional sense, but it was certainly a crisis that required careful handling. As the first hour passed, Camilla showed no signs of wavering in her resolve. She had her phone with her and appeared to be making calls, presumably to family members or advisors who might help strengthen her position. Her children stood nearby, looking increasingly uncomfortable with the attention their mother's actions were drawing. The legal advisor returned twice during this period, attempting to convince Camilla to move their discussion to a more appropriate venue. He suggested his private office or perhaps one of the formal meeting rooms where such matters were typically handled. But Camilla refused to budge, insisting that the location was irrelevant since the real issue was the unreasonable restrictions being placed on her family. Around noon, the situation took another turn when additional family members began arriving at the palace. Camilla had apparently called for reinforcements, and several relatives appeared in the corridor, ostensibly to provide moral support. The Queen's wing, which was normally one of the quietest areas of the palace, began to feel crowded and chaotic. The royal guard realized that this was escalating beyond anything that could be handled through normal security protocols. He made the difficult decision to contact the palace's chief of staff, knowing that this would officially elevate the situation to the highest levels of palace management. There would be no keeping this quiet now. During the second hour of the standoff, some of the gathered family members began expressing their own opinions about the late Queen's belongings. They discussed various items they remembered seeing during previous visits, suggesting that surely some things could be redistributed to family members who would appreciate them. These conversations were taking place in full view and hearing of the palace staff, making everyone increasingly uncomfortable. The palace cook, who had been preparing afternoon tea, found herself in the awkward position of asking whether refreshments should be offered to the group staged in the corridor. It was a bizarre situation. Protocol suggested that royal family members should be offered hospitality, but these same family members were essentially conducting a sit-in protest against palace authority. The royal guard made the decision to offer tea, hoping that normal courtesies might help diffuse some of the tension. But even this simple gesture became complicated when Camilla used it as an opportunity to point out that the china service being used had belonged to the late Queen and might be exactly the kind of item that families should inherit rather than leave in storage. As the afternoon wore on, the standoff began attracting attention from other parts of the palace. Senior staff members who normally worked in completely different departments found reasons to walk through the area. The palace telephone operators reported an unusual number of internal calls asking about the situation in the Queen's wing. The most uncomfortable moment came when a group of visiting dignitaries who were scheduled for a separate meeting elsewhere in the palace accidentally wandered into the corridor while being given a tour. They encountered the surreal scene of the Queen consort and her family essentially camping out in front of the late Queen's study, surrounded by security officers and staff members who clearly didn't know what to do. The tour guide, an experienced palace employee, managed to redirect the visitors to another route, but not before they had witnessed enough to ask questions about what was happening. Word of the incident would undoubtedly spread beyond the palace walls, potentially creating public relations challenges that the monarchy could ill afford. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the standoff had lasted over 4 hours. Camilla remained in her chair, though she had accepted a cushion from one of the staff members and had moved to a slightly more comfortable position. Her resolve seemed as strong as ever, and she continued to make phone calls that suggested she was building a case for her position. The royal guard had maintained his post throughout the entire ordeal, but the strain was beginning to show. He had missed his lunch break and had been standing at attention for hours while managing one of the most delicate situations of his career. His radio had been busy with reports from other parts of the palace as his superiors tried to figure out how to resolve the crisis without causing lasting damage to royal relationships. The palace's chief of staff finally arrived on the scene. Around 4 o'clock, having spent several hours in emergency meetings with senior advisors and legal experts. His expression was grave as he surveyed the situation. The queen consort still seated in protest, her family members scattered around the corridor, staff members trying to maintain normal operations, and security officers maintaining their positions with increasing awkwardness. The chief of staff requested a private meeting with Camilla, but she initially refused, stating that she had already had enough private conversations that led nowhere. She wanted assurances that something concrete would be accomplished before she would agree to move the discussion away from the study door. This refusal to engage in private negotiations marked a new level of escalation. The chief of staff had hoped to resolve the matter quietly, but Camilla's insistence on maintaining her public protest meant that the situation would have to be addressed more directly and with potentially more serious consequences. As the day stretched toward evening, it became clear that this standoff was not going to end with simple compromise or diplomacy. Something more decisive would have to happen, and everyone present seemed to sense that they were approaching a point of no return. The tension in the corridor had reached a breaking point. After nearly 5 hours of standoff, something had to give. The royal guard could see the exhaustion on everyone's faces. The staff members who had been trying to work around the unusual situation, the security officers who had been maintaining their positions, and even Camilla's own family members who were beginning to show signs of regret about how far this had escalated. But Camilla herself seemed energized by the confrontation rather than worn down by it. She had spent the last hour making increasingly bold statements about her rights as queen consort and her family's legitimate claims to the late queen's belongings. Her voice had grown louder and her gestures more animated, as if the extended standoff had only strengthened her resolve. The moment that changed everything came at exactly 4:47 in the afternoon. The royal guard would remember that time for the rest of his life, because that's when Camilla made her fatal mistake. She stood up from her chair, looked directly at him, and announced that she was done waiting for bureaucrats and lawyers to sort out what should be a simple family matter. Before anyone could react, she strode purposefully toward the study door. Her intention was crystal clear. She was going to enter the queen's private sanctuary whether she had permission or not. The royal guard found himself with seconds to make a decision that would define not just his career, but potentially the future of royal protocol itself. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion. Camilla's hand reached for the ornate brass door handle while her family members called out behind her, some urging her on, others pleading with her to reconsider. The palace staff who had gathered to witness the standoff collectively held their breath. Even the ancient walls of the castle seemed to lean in, as if centuries of royal history were watching to see what would happen next. The royal guard stepped forward and placed his hand firmly on the door, blocking Camilla's access. His voice was steady but carried an authority that everyone present immediately recognized. He informed her that he could not allow unauthorized entry to the sealed study and that she would need to step back immediately. For a moment, Camilla seemed shocked that he had actually physically intervened. In all her years as part of the royal family, no one had ever directly blocked her path or challenged her authority so directly. Her surprise quickly turned to anger, and she demanded that he remove his hand and allow her to enter what she called her family's property. The royal guard maintained his position, but now he was face to face with the queen consort in a way that felt both surreal and deeply uncomfortable. He could see the determination in her eyes, but he could also sense that she hadn't fully thought through the consequences of what she was trying to do. This wasn't just about jewelry or books anymore. It was about the fundamental question of who had ultimate authority over royal estates and traditions. Camilla's eldest child stepped forward, attempting to defuse the situation by suggesting that perhaps they could all take a step back and discuss this more calmly. But Camilla was beyond listening to reason. She had invested too much time and energy in this confrontation to back down now, and she seemed to view any retreat as an admission of defeat. What happened next would be discussed in palace circles for decades to come. Camilla actually tried to push past the royal guard, using her shoulder to attempt to move him aside while reaching again for the door handle. It was a desperate move that crossed every line of royal protocol and put the royal guard in an impossible position. In that instant, the royal guard knew that he had no choice but to exercise his ultimate authority as head of security for the Queen's estate. He stepped fully in front of the door and formally informed Camilla that she was no longer welcome in this wing of the palace and would need to leave immediately. His words carried the full weight of his office and the backing of decades of royal law and tradition. The silence that followed was deafening. No one present had ever witnessed anything like this in their entire careers of royal service. The Queen Consort had just been officially asked to leave a section of the royal residence by palace security. It was unprecedented, shocking, and absolutely necessary. Camilla's face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, anger, and finally a kind of cold fury that made everyone in the corridor take an involuntary step backward. She looked around at the gathered staff members and family members as if seeing them clearly for the first time, perhaps realizing how many witnesses there were to this historic confrontation. Her family members were equally stunned. They had supported her initial requests and even understood her frustration with the legal complications, but none of them had expected it to escalate to the point where she would be formally expelled from part of the palace. The reality of what had just happened began to sink in, and several of them started gathering their belongings as if preparing to leave. But Camilla wasn't ready to accept defeat. She demanded to speak with King Charles immediately, insisting that this was a gross overreach of authority that her husband would never tolerate. She threatened consequences for the royal guard's career and questioned whether he understood the gravity of what he had just done to a member of the royal family. The royal guard remained calm but firm in his response. He explained that he was acting within his legal authority as defined by the royal estate protocols, and that these same protocols provided clear channels for appealing his decisions through proper legal channels. He was not being disrespectful to her personally, but he was fulfilling his sworn duty to protect the late Queen's legacy according to her explicit wishes. The head of palace security had arrived during this exchange, having been summoned by one of the junior officers. His presence added additional weight to the royal guard's position and made it clear that this wasn't the action of a single individual, but rather the enforcement of established palace policy. Camilla's family members began, urging her to leave with them, pointing out that continuing the confrontation would only make the situation worse for everyone involved. They reminded her that there would be other opportunities to address these issues through proper channels, and that maintaining her dignity in this moment was more important than winning this particular battle. The escort out of the Queen's wing was conducted with as much dignity as possible under the circumstances. The royal guard personally accompanied Camilla and her family members, ensuring that they left through a route that would minimize their exposure to other palace staff and visitors. Despite the seriousness of what had just occurred, he maintained his professional courtesy and treated them with the respect due to their positions. As they walked through the corridors toward the main palace areas, Camilla made several more attempts to justify her actions and threaten consequences for what she called this humiliation. But her words seemed to carry less weight now, as if the reality of being officially removed from the premises had diminished her authority rather than strengthened. The actual exit from the Queen's wing took only 10 minutes, but it felt much longer to everyone involved. Palace staff members who encountered the procession quickly found other routes or pressing duties that took them elsewhere. No one wanted to be seen witnessing what was clearly a family crisis that had spun completely out of control. When they finally reached the boundary of the Queen's wing, Camilla turned back one final time to face the royal guard. Her parting words were a promise that this matter was far from over, and that he would face serious consequences for his actions. But there was something hollow about her threats now, as if she understood that crossing the line from family dispute to security incident had changed the nature of the entire conflict. As Camilla and her family members disappeared around the corner, heading toward their private quarters in another part of the palace, the royal guard finally allowed himself to breathe. The immediate crisis was over, but he knew that the real consequences were only just beginning. The palace felt different that evening. Word of the unprecedented confrontation had spread through every corridor, every kitchen, and every garden path. Staff members who had worked at the royal residence for decades found themselves in hushed conversations, trying to make sense of what they had witnessed. Nothing in their training or experience had prepared them for seeing the queen consort formally escorted out of the late queen's private wing. The royal guard returned to his office. As the sun was setting, but he couldn't focus on his usual end-of-day responsibilities. His hands were steady, but his mind was racing through everything that had happened. In a single afternoon, he had made decisions that could either be seen as heroically defending royal traditions or catastrophically overstepping his authority. Time would tell which interpretation would prevail. Within hours of the incident, his phone began ringing. The palace's legal team wanted detailed reports. Senior advisors needed to understand exactly what had transpired and why. Most concerning of all, there were indications that King Charles himself was being briefed on the situation and would need to make some very difficult decisions about how to handle the aftermath. Meanwhile, in another part of the palace, Camilla was having her own challenging evening. The reality of what had happened was sinking in, and it wasn't comfortable. She had started the day believing she was making reasonable requests for family heirlooms, but she had ended it by being officially removed from a section of her own home. The transformation from queen consort to security risk had happened so quickly that she was still trying to process it. Her family members had scattered to their own quarters, each dealing with the day's events in their own way. Some were angry on her behalf, feeling that the palace staff had been disrespectful and rigid. Others were quietly concerned that things had gone too far, and that lasting damage might have been done to family relationships and royal reputation. The next morning brought no relief for anyone involved. The palace's chief of staff arrived at work to find a complex crisis that required immediate attention. This wasn't just about family dynamics anymore. It was about maintaining the integrity of royal institutions while preserving relationships that were essential to the monarchy's future. The first major decision came within 24 hours of the incident. King Charles requested separate meetings with both the royal guard and Camilla. These weren't going to be casual conversations, but formal discussions that would determine how the palace would move forward from this unprecedented situation. The royal guard's meeting with the king was scheduled for 10 o'clock on Wednesday morning. He had spent the entire night reviewing every document, every protocol, and every legal precedent that supported his actions. He knew that his career, and possibly his entire future, depended on being able to clearly explain why he had felt compelled to take such drastic action against a member of the royal family. When the moment came, the king listened carefully as the royal guard presented his case. He explained the late queen's specific wishes regarding her personal belongings, the legal framework that governed royal estates, and the escalating pattern of behavior that had led to the confrontation. Most importantly, he emphasized that his actions had been motivated entirely by loyalty to the crown and respect for royal traditions, not by any personal conflict with the queen consort. King Charles asked detailed questions about the specific items that Camilla had requested, the legal status of those items, and the precedents for handling such disputes. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours, during which the king demonstrated a thorough understanding of both the legal complexities and the family dynamics involved in the situation. The king's meeting with Camilla took place that same afternoon, and it was reportedly much more emotionally charged. She presented her perspective on the events, arguing that she had been treated unfairly and that her requests had been reasonable given her position in the family. She expressed feeling humiliated by the public nature of her removal from the Queen's wing and questioned whether the palace staff understood their proper role in relation to the current royal family. But King Charles had done his homework. He had spent hours reviewing his late mother's will and the detailed notes she had left about her personal belongings. He understood exactly why each item had been designated for specific purposes and recipients. More importantly, he recognized that allowing exceptions or modifications to these carefully planned distributions could set dangerous precedents for future generations. The resolution that emerged from these meetings surprised many people at the palace. Rather than choosing sides or trying to find a compromise that might satisfy everyone, King Charles made decisions that upheld both royal traditions and family relationships, though not in the way that anyone had expected. First, he formally supported the Royal Guard's actions during the confrontation. In a written statement distributed to senior palace staff, the king confirmed that the Royal Guard had acted appropriately within his authority and in accordance with established protocols. This official backing ensured that there would be no consequences to the Royal Guard's career and sent a clear message about the importance of respecting royal estate procedures. However, King Charles also took steps to address the underlying family concerns that had led to the conflict. He arranged for a comprehensive review of his mother's personal belongings, not to change her designated distributions, but to ensure that family members fully understood the reasoning behind her decisions. This review would be conducted by legal experts and family historians who could explain the significance of various items and the logic of the Queen's choices. Most significantly, the king established new protocols for handling future requests regarding royal estates. These procedures would provide clear channels for family members to ask questions, seek clarification, and understand the historical and legal context of estate decisions. The goal was to prevent future conflicts by ensuring that everyone understood the rules and reasoning behind them. Camilla received a detailed explanation of why her specific requests could not be honored. The pearls she had wanted for her daughter, for example, had been designated for a museum collection because of their historical significance to the Commonwealth. The rare books she had hoped to acquire were promised to the Royal Library, where they would be preserved for future scholars and researchers. But the king also made an important gesture toward family harmony. He arranged for certain items that were not specifically mentioned in the late Queen's will to be distributed among family members as personal mementos. These weren't the valuable pieces that Camilla had originally requested, but they were meaningful objects that could provide genuine connections to the late Queen's memory. The new protocols that emerged from this crisis became a model for other royal families dealing with similar issues. They balanced respect for the deceased's wishes with the emotional needs of surviving family members, while maintaining clear boundaries about what could and could not be changed after someone's passing. The Royal Guard continued in his position, though his relationship with Camilla remained formally polite rather than warmly personal. He had proven his loyalty to royal traditions under the most difficult circumstances, and his reputation within the palace was actually enhanced by his willingness to make such a difficult decision. The palace staff who had witnessed the confrontation gradually returned to their normal routines, but the incident had taught them important lessons about the complexities of royal service. They had seen firsthand how personal relationships and institutional responsibilities could sometimes conflict, and how important it was to maintain professional standards even in emotionally charged situations. Camilla eventually accepted the resolution, though it took several months for the family relationships to fully heal. She came to understand that the late Queen's decisions had been based on decades of experience and careful consideration of what would best serve the monarchy's future. While she never entirely agreed with all the restrictions, she respected the legal framework that governed them. The incident became a turning point in how the royal family handled estate matters, creating clearer communication and better understanding of the complex traditions that guided these decisions. Most importantly, it demonstrated that even in the most difficult circumstances, royal institutions could maintain their integrity while preserving family relationships for future generations.